The night the sky turned red over Thornmere Vale, Durgesh Bonecrusher stood over her husband's body with a broken spear in her hand and death closing in from every side. Goreth Skarn lay face down in the frozen mud, an arrow buried in the gap beneath his collarbone where his armor had failed him, and around her the warband that had ambushed them in the dark kept coming, wave after wave of them, howling Threk Vulgar's name like a battle hymn. Durgesh had already put 2 of them down. Her arms shook with the cold and the blood loss from the gash along her ribs, but she planted her feet in the snow and raised the broken spear anyway, because a Skarn did not run, and she would not be the first. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A big-boned gray gelding crashed through the tree line at a dead run, and on its back was a man in a fur-lined ranger's coat, a human, of all things, with a hunting bow already drawn and an arrow already loosed before he'd even fully cleared the trees. One of Vulgar's warriors went down clutching his throat. The man knocked a second arrow before the first had finished falling. "Get behind me!" He shouted, and it took Durgesh a moment to realize he was shouting it at her. She did not get behind him. She had never in her life gotten behind anyone. But she pivoted so her back met the flank of his horse, and together they turned in a rough circle, the human loosing arrows into the dark and Durgesh swinging the jagged half of her spear at anything that came within reach. And for one strange, breathless moment it worked. The attackers pulled back into the shadows of the pines, unwilling to lose more men to a madwoman and a sharpshooter both. "Who are you?" she demanded, not lowering her weapon, her breath fogging white in the cold. "Harlan Talbot, frontier scout out of Frostwatch Hold." He swung down from the saddle in one motion, quick and steady despite the arrows still hissing out of the dark toward them, and pressed his shoulder against her good side to hold her upright when her knees buckled without warning. "You're bleeding worse than you think you are. I have bled worse than this. Maybe, but you're about to bleed out on top of it if you don't get on this horse." She wanted to argue. Every instinct in her screamed to stand over Goreth's body until the last breath left her. Because that was what a Skarn wife did. That was the old law. Blood answered blood on the same ground it was spilled. But the world had gone gray and soft at the edges, and the human's hands were already lifting her, and she was too weak in that moment to refuse him. "My husband," she said, or tried to say, the words slurring. "I'm sorry," Harlan Talbot said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it even through the roaring in her ears, "but he's gone and you're not, and I intend to keep it that way." He got her up onto the gray gelding in front of him, one arm locked hard around her waist, and he turned the horse north, toward the lantern glow of Frostwatch Hold rising against the Black Mountains, and he rode like the whole of Vulgar's warband was breathing down his neck, because it was. Durgesh felt the arrows whistle past close enough to stir her hair. She felt Harlan Talbot's heart hammering against her back, felt his arm tighten every time she swayed, felt the impossible warmth of a stranger's body pressed to hers in the freezing dark, while everything she had ever built or loved lay dying behind her in the snow. By the time the gates of Frostwatch Hold groaned open to take them in, she had stopped fighting to stay conscious, and the last thing she remembered before the dark took her fully was the sound of his voice, low and urgent, saying her name for the first time though she had never told it to him. Someone in the yard must have shouted it. "Bonecrusher, they know the Bonecrusher, get the healer," and his arms not once letting her go. She woke 3 days later to firelight and the smell of tallow candles and boiled herbs, and to the old healer of Frostwatch Hold standing over her with a wooden cup. "Drink this," the healer said. Her name was Ilsa Crane, and she had the brisk, unimpressed manner of a woman who had set more broken bones than she could count and had no patience left over for theatrics. "It will ease the fever and close what stitches I've put in you. Drink it now before it goes cold." Durgesh looked at the cup. She looked at the woman's hand holding it, weathered and human and utterly unfamiliar, and something in her chest locked shut like a fist. "No," she said. "It is not poison if that is your worry." "I did not say it was poison." Durgesh's voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw from 3 days of silence. Her ribs screamed when she tried to sit further up, and she let herself sink back against the furs instead, glaring at the low timber rafters of the room they had put her in. I said no. Ilsa Crane's mouth thinned. You will die of the fever if you do not take it. Then I will die. Durgesh. That voice again, low and steady, and Durgesh turned her head to find Harlan Talbot standing in the doorway with his arms crossed and snow still melting off his boots, as though he had come straight in from the cold to hear this argument. He must have given the healer her name, or one of the men at the gate had. It did not matter. Hearing it in his mouth did something strange and unwelcome to the inside of her ribs. You didn't fight off 6 of Vulgar's men just to lie down and die in a warm bed. That would be a waste of a very good fight. You do not know anything about my fight. I know I watched you break a man's jaw with the butt of a spear that was already broken in half. That's not nothing. He came further into the room, and Ilsa Crane, reading something in his face, stepped back to let him near the bed, though she kept the cup in her own hand still, unwilling yet to hand it over. You don't trust her, Draught. Fine. I don't blame you. You don't know her. You don't know this place. You've got every reason in the world not to trust a single soul inside these walls. Then why should I trust you? Durgesh said, though it came out quieter than she wanted, less a challenge than a genuine question, and she hated how much that quiet betrayed her. Harlan held her gaze. He had plain brown eyes, a scout's weathered face, a jaw that had not been shaved in some days. Nothing about him remarkable at all except the steadiness with which he looked at her, as though she were not an orc widow bleeding into his healer's bedsheets but simply a person, someone whose answer mattered to him. Because I'm the one who didn't leave you in the snow, he said. That's all I've got to offer you. It isn't much, but it's true. Durgesh held his eyes for a long moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, she looked away from him to the healer. Give it to him, she said. He gives it to me, or I do not drink it at all. Ilsa Crane made a small, disbelieving sound in her throat, but she held the cup out to Harlan without further argument, because arguing with a wounded orc widow twice her size was not a fight she wanted any part of. Harlan took it. He crossed the last few feet to the bed and knelt beside it, so that his face was level with hers, and for one absurd heartbeat neither of them said anything at all. You're going to have to let me help you sit up a little, he said finally, or you'll choke. I do not need help sitting. She tried to prove it, and her ribs screamed loud enough that she hissed through her teeth instead. And Harlan, without a word, without a trace of mockery on his face, slid an arm carefully beneath her shoulders and lifted her just enough to bring her upright against the headboard. His hand was rough and calloused, a working man's hand, and it was gentler than she expected, gentler than she had let herself be touched by anyone since Gorath died. There, he said quietly. Now, drink slow. He brought the cup to her lips himself, tilting it carefully, watching her throat instead of her eyes so as not to make the moment more than it needed to be, though it was already, unmistakably, more than either of them had bargained for. The draught tasted bitter and herbal, and she swallowed it anyway because his hand was steady and his eyes, when she finally looked up into them, held nothing but plain, unhurried patience. There, he said again, when the cup was empty. That wasn't so terrible, was it? It tasted like boiled bark. Most healing draughts do. Ilsa's a fine healer, terrible cook. He set the empty cup down on the little table beside the bed, and for a moment his hand lingered near hers on the furs, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it without either of them quite touching. You should sleep. You'll heal faster. Why did you do that? Durgesh asked before she could stop herself. Why did you come out there in the snow? You did not know me. You owed my people nothing. Harlan considered the question longer than she expected him to. I've ridden that border for 6 years, he said finally. I know every trail through Thornmere Vale, every hollow and deadfall, better than I know my own hands. I've watched good people die on both sides of that line over land nobody living even remembers the true edges of anymore. I didn't come out there for your people, Durgesh Bonecrusher. I came because I heard fighting, and because somebody was about to die who didn't have to, and because that's simply the kind of thing I can't ride past. That's the whole of it. No grander reason than that. It should have been an unsatisfying answer. Instead, it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples out further than she wanted to examine. "My husband is dead," she said, because it needed saying aloud to someone, and there was no one else in Frostwatch Hold who would understand the shape of that particular grief. "I know," Harlan said. "I'm sorry for it, truly. He was a good chieftain, a better husband than most." She closed her eyes. "Threk Vulgar wanted our valley for a decade. Now he has murdered his way to it." "Then we'll see that he doesn't keep it," Harlan said, with a quiet certainty that surprised her. And though she did not yet know what he meant by "we," she found, against every instinct honed by a lifetime of war, that she believed him. The winter deepened around Frostwatch Hold like a held breath. Durgash healed slowly in the weeks that followed, and Harlan Talbot came to see her nearly every day, at first with the excuse of reporting to Commander Aldrich Vane on the state of the border, and later with no excuse at all beyond the plain fact that he wanted to. He brought her furs when the wind off the mountains cut through the timber walls. He brought her news of the Skarn clan's scattered remnants, gathered from his rides along the frontier, word that some of Goreth's warriors had regrouped in the high passes, unwilling to bow to Vulgar, waiting for a word from her. He brought, once, a carved wooden comb, awkward and plain, because her hair had grown matted and tangled from days of fever, and he set it on the table beside her bed without comment, and left before she could decide whether to thank him or throw it at his head. She kept the comb. She used it every morning after that, sitting by the narrow window of the healer's room, watching the snow fall over the palisade walls, and each time her fingers closed around its worn handle, she thought of the steadiness of his hand around the cup, and something in her that had gone cold and hard since Goreth's death began, slowly and against her will, to thaw. The town itself was not so easily won. Frostwatch Hold was a hard little frontier settlement, all timber palisades and stone chimneys, half garrison and half trading post, clinging to the last defensible ground before the mountains rose up into Orc territory proper. Its people had buried sons and husbands in raids along that border for 2 generations, and an Orc woman recovering in their healer's house, whatever her wounds, was not a welcome sight to most of them. The trouble came to a head on a gray morning 6 weeks after the ambush, when Durgash, finally strong enough to walk unassisted, went down into the market square to trade for a length of oiled leather to rebind her cracked vambrace, and found herself surrounded before she had gone 20 paces. "That's her," someone said, low and ugly, from the crowd gathering near the grain stalls. "That's the Skarn woman, Bonecrusher they call her. Killed a dozen men at the Alder Crossing raid 10 years back. And now she walks free in our square," a woman spat, clutching her basket to her chest as though Durgash might snatch it, "while good Frostwatch men lie under snow because of her kind." Durgash's hand went to the hilt of the long knife she still wore, more from ingrained habit than any intention to draw it, but the movement alone sent a ripple of fear and fury through the crowd, and within moments there were a dozen townsfolk pressed close around her. Someone had a pitchfork, someone else a length of firewood held like a club, and the shouting rose fast and ugly the way it always did when frightened people found something they thought was safe to hate. She should not be permitted inside these walls at all. Send her back to her murdering clan, or better, put her outside the gates and let the wolves have her. Durgash did not step back. She had faced worse odds with worse wounds, but she felt, for the first time since Goreth's death, something colder than fear settle into her, the old, familiar knowledge that no matter what she did or did not do, she would always be this to them, a monster wearing a woman's shape, never simply a widow grieving in a market square. That is enough. Harlan's voice cracked across the square like a dropped rafter, and the crowd turned as he shouldered his way through them, plain scout's coat and all, putting himself bodily between Durgash and the man with the pitchfork. "Lower that," he said, and there was nothing gentle in his voice now at all. "Lower it, or so help me, Combe Fenner, I will put you on your back in front of your own wife. She's an orc, Talbot, one of them that's been butchering our border for years. She's a widow who buried her husband 3 weeks ago and rode half dead into this hold because I brought her here. And if any one of you lays a hand on her, you'll answer to me and then you'll answer to Commander Vane. And I promise you'll like his temper even less than mine." Harlan's eyes swept the crowd, and something in the flat certainty of his stare made even the angriest of them falter. "I've walked that border for 6 years. I've buried friends that died to raiders wearing Scarn colors, and I've buried friends that died to our own men picking fights they didn't need to pick. I know the difference between a threat and a grieving woman standing in a market square trying to buy leather. Do the rest of you." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, but it was silence, and slowly, grudgingly, the crowd began to disperse, muttering, casting backward glances, the man with the pitchfork lowering it at last with a scowl he didn't bother hiding. Durgesh said nothing until they were alone amid the abandoned stalls, snow beginning to drift down again between the timber buildings. "You did not need to do that," she said finally. "I know I didn't need to." Harlan's jaw was still tight, his shoulders still braced as though he expected the crowd to turn back. "I wanted to. They will hate you for it now as well. Some of them already do." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I've been the fool who rides too far into orc country and comes back with wild stories since before you ever met me. This won't be the thing that ruins my reputation, Durgesh. It'll just be one more log on the fire." She studied him for a long moment, snow catching in his dark hair, his breath fogging in the cold, standing his ground in a square full of people who despised him for the crime of decency, and something in her chest, some old and careful wall, cracked clean through. "Come," she said abruptly. "Walk with me back to the healer's house. I still require the leather. You didn't get it. No, but I find I no longer wish to stand in that square." A pause, and then low, almost too quiet to hear. "I would rather stand beside you." Harlan looked at her as though she had struck him. Then slowly, he offered his arm, an absurd courtesy from a scout to a warrior twice as capable of defending herself as he was, and Durgesh, to her own faint astonishment, took it. Spring did not come early to that country, but something else did. It happened on a night when Harlan came to walk the palisade watch and found Durgesh already there, wrapped in her wolf fur mantle, watching the black line of the mountains where, somewhere beyond, the remnants of her husband's clan waited for word from her that she did not yet know how to send. She had recovered fully by then, moved from Ilsa Crane's healer house into a small chamber near the garrison, and the fitted leather she wore now dark, supple, laced tight across a strong torso. A warrior's garb built for a warrior's frame made her look, in the moonlight, less like a widow and more like the fearsome thing the townsfolk whispered about, all sharp angles and coiled strength, and yet when she turned to find him beside her, her face was simply, achingly tired. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you. Can't sleep. Vane's had word Vulgar's sending riders south, testing our patrols along Thornmere. I keep thinking on it. He tests you because he believes you weak without a warband leader to answer him." Durgesh's hands tightened on the palisade rail. "He is not wrong to test it. Frostwatch Hold has no chieftain bound to it by blood, and my husband's clan has none either, not until someone claims that place again. Someone like you." She said nothing to that, and Harlan, watching the way moonlight silvered the strong line of her jaw, the fierce and lonely set of her shoulders, found himself speaking before he'd fully decided to. "I think about you more than I ought to," he said. "I want you to know that, not because you're wounded or a widow or because I feel I owe you kindness for how we met. I think about you because I like the sound of your voice when you argue with me, and I like that you've never once pretended to be softer than you are for my comfort, and I think—" He stopped, exhaled hard into the cold air. "I think I have not felt this unguarded around anyone in a very long time, and it terrifies me a little, and I wanted you to know it regardless." Durgesh turned fully to face him. The wind pulled strands of dark hair loose from the braid at her temple, and for a long moment she simply looked at him, searching his face for the lie she had spent a lifetime expecting from humans and finding, as she always found now, none. "My people have a custom," she said slowly. "When a warrior wishes to court another, she does not speak pretty words first. She offers something of value, a trophy, a blade, proof that she has weighed the other's worth and found it real. I don't have much to offer that would count as a trophy, Durgesh. I'm a scout, not a warrior." "You brought me a comb," she said, and something in her voice had gone unexpectedly soft. "Carved with your own hands, though it was crooked and the teeth uneven. And you gave it to me without asking anything in return, though I had nothing to give you back and you did not know if I ever would. That is worth more to me than any trophy taken from an enemy's corpse, Harlan Talbot. That is worth more than gold. Durgesh," she closed the last distance between them herself, one strong hand rising to the side of his face, calloused fingers achingly careful against his jaw, as though she had learned, only recently and with great effort, how to be gentle with something she wanted to keep. "I am done waiting for permission to want what I want," she said low. "I buried a husband 3 months past. I do not intend to bury my own heart alongside him out of some foolish sense of what a widow ought to feel. Tell me if you do not want this, and I will step back and never raise it again. But do not lie to me out of kindness. I would rather have your honest refusal than your gentle pity." "I don't want you to step back," Harlan said, and his voice had gone rough. "I have wanted this since the moment you told that healer you wouldn't drink unless I held the cup myself. I just didn't think a woman like you could ever want a man like me back." "Then you have understood nothing about me at all," Durgesh murmured and kissed him. It was not gentle, not at first. There was too much banked hunger in it for gentleness, too many weeks of careful distance breaking apart at once. But Harlan's arms came around her without hesitation, one hand sliding up into her loosened hair, and she made a low sound against his mouth that was equal parts fierce and undone. And when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard in the cold night air, she pressed her forehead to his and did not move away. "This will not be simple," she said. "Your people will not easily accept it, nor, I think, will mine." "I've never once in my life wanted anything simple," Harlan said, and kissed her again, softer this time, and the palisade watch that night went, by mutual and unspoken agreement, thoroughly unwalked. The trouble Durgesh had promised came sooner and harder than either of them expected. It began with fire in the night, 3 weeks later, when a raiding party struck the eastern edge of Frostwatch Hold's grazing lands under cover of a moonless sky. Not Vulgar's warriors outright, but scouts sent to test the border's weaknesses, and they found one. A shepherd's outpost, thinly guarded, where 2 garrison men and a dozen head of cattle burned before the alarm bell ever rang. Harlan was out on the eastern trail when it happened, running his usual patrol, and he saw the glow of it through the trees before he heard the screaming. He never afterward could say clearly how he got there so fast, only that his horse ran itself half to death getting him to the burning outpost, and that he arrived to find 3 raiders already dead by someone else's hand, and Durgesh Bonecrusher standing over the last of them with her long knife red to the hilt, her wolf fur mantle scorched at one edge, blood hers, he realized with a lurch of raw fear sheeting down from a gash above her eyebrow. "Durgesh." "I am well," she snarled, though she swayed even as she said it, and one of the raiders she'd thought finished suddenly wasn't, rising up behind her with a hand axe raised for her unprotected back. Harlan didn't think. He was off his horse and across the frozen ground before the axe could fall, driving his shoulder into the raider's chest with everything his body had left to give, and they went down together into the snow in a tangle of limbs and fists, the axe spinning away useless into the dark. It was not a clean fight. Harlan was no warrior, had never claimed to be one, and the raider was bigger and better trained. And for a handful of terrible seconds, Harlan thought he might actually lose this. might die here in the snow with the taste of blood in his mouth and Durgash too far and too wounded to reach him in time. Then the raider simply stopped moving, and Durgash was there, hauling the man's dead weight off him with a strength that should not have belonged to someone bleeding as freely as she was, and she dropped her bloodied knife into the snow and pulled Harlan bodily against her chest, both of them collapsing together into the frost, hearts slamming, breath tearing raw and ragged out of both their throats. "You reckless, foolish man," she gasped against his hair, one arm locked around his shoulders like she meant never to unlock it. "You could have died. You are not a warrior. You have no business throwing yourself onto an axe." "Neither do you," Harlan managed, standing there swaying like you're about to fall over, bleeding out in front of a burning barn. "I'm always bleeding out in front of something. It is simply how my life has gone, Durgash." He pulled back just far enough to look at her, at the blood on her face, the exhausted, fierce, terrified love in her eyes that she had never once let him see so plainly before, and something in his chest cracked open entirely. "I can't lose you. Do you understand that? I have already built my whole world around the fact of you being in it. I can't lose you now." "You will not lose me," she said fiercely, and kissed him hard enough to bruise, right there in the snow and smoke and blood, both of them shaking, both of them unable to let go, tangled together on the frozen ground as the burning outpost cast long orange light over the drifts around them. "I did not survive Vulgar's ambush and 3 weeks of that miserable healer's draft simply to die in a shepherd's field. I am not so easily rid of Harlan Talbot. You will have to try considerably harder than that." He laughed, half a sob, and buried his face against her throat, and they stayed like that a long while, wrapped around each other in the ruin and the cold, until Frostwatch riders finally arrived to see to the wounded and put out what remained of the fire. Commander Aldrich Vane summoned Harlan to his study 3 days after the raid, and the news he delivered arrived like a second fire, banked but no less dangerous. "Threk Vulgar has sent formal word," Vane said, standing at the narrow window of his timber and stone quarters, watching snow fall over the palisade. "He claims the eastern raid was not his doing, scattered warriors acting outside his command, punished already, or so he says. I do not believe him for a moment, but he has offered something in its place, a resolution to Thornmere Vale binding before the thaw." "What kind of resolution?" Harlan asked, though something cold was already coiling in his stomach. "By Orc law, land claimed by a fallen chieftain passes to whoever weds his widow, provided the clan elders witness and sanction the union before a full turn of seasons has passed since the chieftain's death. Vulgar intends to invoke that law. He means to formally claim Durgash Bonecrusher as his bride at the spring gathering, and with her, the whole of the valley, ending the border dispute permanently in his favor." Harlan's hands had gone still and white-knuckled at his sides. "She'd never agree to that." "It may not require her agreement, Talbot. Among the northern clans, a widow can be claimed through what they call the claiming, a public gathering where suitors present tribute and challenge, and the strongest claim stands unless she names a champion to contest it in her place. It is old law and ugly, but it is law the Skarn elders still honor, and if Vulgar forces the gathering and none contest him, she may have no lawful way to refuse. Then I'll contest him myself. Harlan." Vane turned from the window, and for the first time in their long acquaintance, something almost like pity crossed his weathered face. "You are a scout. He is a war chief who has killed men with his bare hands. If you stand against him and lose, he will simply take her anyway, and you will be dead in the snow beside her husband's grave. Think carefully before you throw your life onto that fire." "I have thought about it," Harlan said. "I thought about it the moment you said his name." That night he told Durgash everything, sitting together in the small chamber near the garrison where she now made her home, a low fire crackling in the hearth, her wolf fur mantle draped over the chair between them. She listened in silence until he finished, her jaw tight, her hands closed into fists on her knees. "He killed Gorath to have this claim," she said finally, low and burning. "I always suspected it. Now I am certain." Durgesh, I will not be claimed like a piece of disputed land, Harlan. I do not care what old law says. I would rather die on that gathering ground than kneel to that murdering coward. You won't have to kneel to anyone. Harlan reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and though it was easily twice the strength of his own, she let him hold it, let her fingers curl tight around his. I'm going to be your champion. I already told Vane as much. No, the word came out sharp and immediate, almost frightened, an emotion so rare on her that it startled him more than any anger could have. No, absolutely not. Threk Vulgar would break you in half before the first exchange finished. I have seen him fight. I will not watch you die for my sake, Harlan. I will not survive it. Then we find another way, Harlan said, because I am not letting that man take you while I stand by and do nothing, Durgesh. That is simply not a thing I am capable of. You must understand that about me by now. She was quiet a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had gone rough with something that was not quite tears but stood very close to them. There is another way, she said slowly. It is older even than the right of challenge. A widow may refuse the claiming entirely if she declares before the gathering that her heart is already bound to another, and offers proof of the binding that the elders themselves can witness. It is rarely invoked. It requires courage most would rather not spend, because it means declaring the bond publicly before both peoples and inviting every consequence that follows. Then let's invoke it. Harlan. She turned to look at him fully, and there was fear in her eyes now, real fear, the kind she had not shown even facing down Vulgar's raiders with a knife in her hand. If we do this and it fails, and the elders do not accept a human as a lawful bondmate under Skarn law, Vulgar will have every right to kill you where you stand, for the insult of the claim alone. This is not a small risk I am asking you to consider. I know it. Harlan lifted her hand, rough and strong and trembling faintly now, and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slow and deliberate. I have never in my life had anything worth this kind of risk before, Durgesh. I have been a lonely man walking a lonely border for 6 years, coming home each night to an empty cabin, and nothing waiting for me but my own supper going cold. You are the first thing that has ever made that border feel like it led somewhere worth arriving. I would rather die standing beside you at that gathering than live another 60 years never having tried. Durgesh made a sound low in her throat, something caught between a laugh and a sob, and pulled him out of his chair and into her arms, and that night, for the first time, neither of them let go until dawn. It was not rushed, and it was not careless. It was the culmination of a season's slow-building want, of every stolen glance and charged silence and careful, patient devotion that had passed between them since the night he had held a healer's cup to her lips. And when she finally drew him down into the warmth of the furs, her hands unlacing his coat with the same deliberate care he had once used lifting her upright to drink, he understood, with a certainty that settled into his very bones, that this was no longer merely a woman he had rescued from the snow. This was a woman who had chosen him, entirely and without reservation, and meant to go on choosing him for as long as either of them drew breath. Afterward, wrapped together beneath the furs while the fire burned low, she traced idle patterns against his chest with one calloused finger and murmured, half to herself, I did not think I would ever want anyone again after Gorath. I thought that part of me had been buried with him in the snow. And now I think perhaps it was only sleeping, she said, waiting for someone patient enough to wake it gently instead of by force. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder. You are a fool to challenge Vulgar's claim, Harlan Talbot, but you are my fool now, and I intend to keep you. The spring gathering was held on the open ground below Frostwatch Hold's palisade, where the snow had begun, at last, to thin into gray slush beneath a pale morning sun. And by the time Threk Vulgar's warband arrived at the appointed hour, half the Hold's population had turned out to watch, alongside 200 orc warriors and elders who had traveled down from the high passes to witness the claiming. Durgesh stood at the center of the gathering ground in her ceremonial garb, Her familiar fitted warrior's leathers beneath a heavy fur-trimmed mantle dyed the deep red of the Skarn clan. Her hair, unbound and hung with small bronze rings that marked her as a chieftain's widow, fierce and magnificent and utterly unbowed. And Harlan, standing at the edge of the crowd beside Commander Vane, thought he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful or so dangerous. Threk Vulgar came forward first, exactly as custom demanded, a mountain of a man in black iron armor, his tusks capped in silver, a war axe resting easy across his shoulders as though it weighed nothing at all. "I claim the Widow Bonecrusher," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the gathering ground, "and with her the Valley of Thornmere by right of the old law. I bring tribute 100 head of cattle, iron enough to arm a warband, and my own hand in marriage to end the dispute between our peoples permanently." He smiled, cold and satisfied. "Let any who would challenge this claim step forward now." Silence answered him. Durgash's Skarn warriors, few and scattered as they were, exchanged uneasy glances but did not move, knowing full well what challenging Vulgar's axe would cost them. Harlan Talbot stepped out of the crowd. A murmur rippled across the gathering ground, human and orc alike turning to stare at the scout walking forward in his plain fur-lined coat, utterly unarmored, utterly unremarkable beside Vulgar's ironclad bulk. "I refuse this claim," Harlan said, and his voice, though it shook slightly at the start, grew steadier with every word. "Not by right of challenge. I have no wish to trade blows with you, Threk Vulgar, and no illusions about how that would end. I refuse it by the elder right, the right of a widow to declare her heart already bound, if she has proof the gathering can witness." Vulgar's smile did not waver, but something dangerous entered his eyes. A human, invoking Skarn law. "This is an insult, boy. The elder right exists for orc bonds, not for whatever this is." "The elder right exists for bonds," Durgash said, stepping forward to stand at Harlan's side, her hand finding his without hesitation, in full view of the entire gathering, human and orc alike. "And it names no restriction upon what shape that bond must take. I have read the old law myself, Vulgar, in my husband's own hall, long before you thought to murder him for it." Her voice rang out clear and hard across the frozen ground. "I declare before this gathering that my heart is bound to this man, Harlan Talbot of Frostwatch Hold, and I will offer proof, as the law demands." "Proof," Vulgar spat, "of a bond between an orc and a human. What proof could satisfy the elders of such a claim? The comb he carved for me with his own hands, when I lay dying of fever in a healer's house, and would take medicine from no one else's hand but his." Durgash reached into the fold of her mantle and drew out the worn wooden comb, holding it aloft for the gathered elders to see. "The blood he spilled defending me from your scout's raid on the eastern grazing lands, when he threw himself unarmed at an axe meant for my back, rather than let me die." She turned and pressed her palm flat against Harlan's chest, over his heart, in a gesture the assembled orc elders recognized at once, a low murmur of surprise passing through their ranks. And this, the binding touch, given freely before witnesses, which no widow gives to a man she does not intend to keep. The gathering erupted into noise, elders arguing among themselves, warriors muttering, Frostwatch townsfolk craning for a better view, and Threk Vulgar's face darkened with fury too large to contain. "This is a mockery," he roared, swinging the war axe down off his shoulder into his hands. "I will not lose Thornmere Vale to some clever wordplay and a widow's stubbornness. I killed Goreth Skarn for that land, and I will have it, law or no law." The confession landed across the gathering ground like a thunderclap. Durgash went utterly still. "You admit it," she said, very quietly, and the quiet was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. "You admit before every elder and every witness here that you murdered my husband." "I admit nothing that matters, once you and the valley are mine." He never finished the sentence. Durgash Bonecrusher crossed the space between them faster than a man his size should ever have had to reckon with, and drove her fist into his jaw with the full fury of 3 months' grief and rage behind it, sending him staggering backward into the snow, the war axe flying from his grip. The gathering ground exploded into chaos. Vulgar's warriors surged forward, torn between honor and outrage. Durgash's own scattered Skarn fighters closed ranks around her, weapons drawn. Frostwatch garrison men shouted for order, Commander Vane bellowing above the noise for calm that nobody seemed inclined to give him. And in the middle of it all, Harlan Talbot did the only thing he could think to do, which was to put himself directly between Durgash and the war axe Vulgar was already scrambling to reclaim from the snow. Enough! The voice that finally cut through the chaos was not Vane's, nor Harlan's, but belonged to the eldest of the Skarn elders present, a stooped, silver-haired orc woman leaning on a carved staff, whose single raised hand brought a startling measure of order to the churning crowd. Enough, all of you. Threk Vulgar has confessed murder before witnesses. Whatever claim he believed himself to hold on this valley or this widow dies with that confession, by law older than any claiming custom he has invoked today. Elder Soren, Vulgar started, wiping blood from his split lip, but the old woman's staff cracked against the frozen ground with startling force. You will be bound and returned to the high passes to answer for Goreth Skarn's death before the full council, she said. That is the law, Vulgar, the same law you thought to twist for your own gain, and it does not bend simply because the outcome displeases you. She turned then, her dark eyes settling on Durgash and Harlan still standing together, hands locked tight, in the center of the churned and bloodied snow. As for the widow Bonecrusher's declared bond, it is unusual. It is, I will not pretend otherwise, difficult for many gathered here to accept. Her gaze swept the crowd, human and orc alike, lingering pointedly on the muttering knots of Frostwatch townsfolk who had so recently chased Durgash from their market square. But the proof offered meets the old law's demands, freely given, freely witnessed. I will not stand here and tell a chieftain's widow that her own grief-tempered heart has chosen wrongly, when the man she has chosen stood unarmed against a war chief's axe rather than see her taken against her will. She lowered her staff, and something in the set of her shoulders eased, decades of hard law softening just slightly into something almost like approval. The claiming is ended, Elder Soren declared. The bond stands, witnessed and unbroken. Thornmere Vale remains under Skarn claim, held by the widow Bonecrusher until such time as she names an heir to it by her own choosing. Her eyes found Harlan's, and there was, unmistakably, the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of her weathered mouth. Choose carefully who shares that hearth with her, Scout. I suspect she does not offer that kind of loyalty twice in one lifetime. Vulgar's men bound him without further protest, the fight gone out of them entirely now that their chieftain's crime stood exposed before both peoples. And the gathering ground, so recently a churn of violence and shouted claims, settled slowly into a strange, breathless quiet. Durgash turned to Harlan amid the wreckage of it all, snow still clinging to her unbound hair, her knuckles split and bleeding from the force of her blow against Vulgar's jaw, and something in her fierce, exhausted face had gone luminous with an emotion too large for words. You stood unarmed against a war axe for me, she said, low, disbelieving, as though she needed to say it aloud to fully believe it had happened. I told you, Harlan said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his own hands unsteady now that the danger had passed. I have never once wanted anything simple, I meant it. You are the greatest fool I have ever known, Durgash said, and there were, astonishingly, tears standing bright in her eyes now, and I love you for it more than I know how to say. Say it again, Harlan said. I want to hear it as many times as you're willing to give it. I love you, Durgash said, clear and unashamed, loud enough that half the gathering ground could hear it, human and orc alike, every one of them who had ever doubted the shape a true bond could take. I love you, Harlan Talbot, Scout of Frostwatch Hold, and I do not care one particle for what any of them standing here think of it. Then, with the whole of both peoples watching the townsfolk who had once chased her from the market square, the elders who had nearly denied her chosen bond entirely, Vulgar's bound and humiliated warriors, Commander Vane looking on with something that might, for the first time, have been genuine warmth. Durgesh Bonecrusher pulled Harlan Talbot into her arms and kissed him, deep and defiant and utterly unhurried. A kiss that answered every doubt and every danger of that long, hard winter at once. Nobody in that crowd said a single word against it. Nobody dared. The thaw came properly to Thornmere Vale 3 weeks later, and with it came the slow, patient work of rebuilding what a season of war and grief had broken. Durgesh took formal claim of the valley before the assembled Skarn elders, the first widow in living memory to hold a chieftain's land in her own right, rather than passing it through marriage to another warrior of the clan. And if there were those among the old guard who still muttered about the strangeness of a human standing at her side through the ceremony, none of them muttered it loudly enough for Elder Sauron to overhear. For the old woman had made her feelings on the matter plain, enough that few cared to test them twice. Harlan resigned his post as Frostwatch holds border scout that same spring, not because Commander Vane demanded it, for Vane, to his credit, had grown to respect the man too much by then to want him gone, but because Durgesh asked him, one quiet evening with the windows of her new hall thrown open to the first warm air the valley had felt in months, whether he might consider a different kind of border to watch. "I have spent 6 years learning every trail through that vale for other men's purposes," he said when she'd finished asking. "I think I would like, for once, to learn it simply because it's mine to know. Ours, I mean." He caught himself, and something warm and a little disbelieving crossed his face at the sound of the word in his own mouth. "Ours. Ours," Durgesh agreed, and there was a fierce, quiet joy in the way she said it, the joy of a woman who had once believed all her warmth buried in the snow beside a husband's grave, and had found, against every hard lesson her life had taught her, that love could return to a heart willing to risk itself again. They built their life in the valley slowly, the way all lasting things are built. A timber hall raised on the ridge above Thornmere's thawing fields, close enough to Frostwatch hold that old prejudices could wear thin over shared harvests and shared trade, far enough into Skarn land that Durgesh's people never doubted where her true loyalty lay. Some of the townsfolk who had once driven her from the market square came, eventually sheepishly, to trade grain for Skarn wool at her gates, and she let them, because she had learned from Harlan that a grudge held too long cost more than it ever repaid. On the evening of the valley's first true spring festival, with lanterns strung between the timber posts of the new hall and both peoples mingling below in a way that would have seemed impossible a year before, Durgesh found Harlan standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the same stars that had once watched her husband die in the snow, and settled against his side without a word, her wolf fur mantle drawn close against the last of the cold. "You are thinking of him," Harlan said quietly, not a question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "He was a good man in his way. He would have wanted this valley to know peace again, whatever the cost. I think if he could see it now, he would not begrudge me the manner in which it finally came." She turned to look up at Harlan, moonlight softening the fierce lines of her face into something achingly tender. "He would have liked you, I think, grudgingly. You have his stubbornness, though none of his temper." "I'll take the compliment," Harlan said, smiling. "It was a compliment." She reached up, cupping his jaw the way she had that first night on the palisade, and Harlan turned his face into her palm, eyes falling closed, utterly at home in her touch. "I refused a healer's cup for 3 days because I would not be soothed by strangers' hands, Harlan Talbot. I have refused nothing you have offered me since. I do not intend to start now." "Good," Harlan murmured, "because I don't intend to stop offering." Below them, the festival fires crackled warm against the last of the mountain snow, and the two peoples who had spent a generation and more hating each other across a disputed border mingled beneath the same stars, without a single raised weapon between them. And on the ridge above it all, an orc widow who had once stood alone over her husband's body in the burning dark, leaned into the arms of the human scout who had refused to ride past her, and kissed him slow and certain, and entirely without shame, exactly as she meant to go on doing for every season still owed to them. The border still ran through Thornmere Vale, marked now by nothing more dangerous than a low stone wall the two peoples had built together, and Draught Bonecrusher, chieftain in her own right, no longer needed to fear what lay on either side of it, not while Harlan Talbot stood beside her, steady as he had always been, holding nothing back and asking for nothing she did not want, entirely freely to give.